This next part will be a bit of bridge of a discussion to respond specifically to the emergence of specific diversity and diverse understandings of the nationalisms and various political identities that emerged really very much as a response to and in the context of the inequality, the racism, the exploitation of living under French colonialism. So the second part is an interwoven discussion regarding culture and power. So before we spoke really about capitalism, cities, state making, the ways in which colonial infrastructure transformed language and created this space for modern cultural life. However, as I mentioned, these the form of colonialism exacerbated divisions, created inequality between race, gender, and class. There was a very legally pluralistic experience of colonialism, those in the cities, those who have worked in administration, those who are landowners, and there was an extensive police state of surveillance, of oppression, of suppression, imprisonment, executions, and surveillance of those who were critical of the French colonial authorities. So this next focus is on the emergence of different political ideologies that emerged during this period. So I want to kind of abridge this section just because this generally receives a lot of attention within Vietnamese history. Often it's told in a story that basically kind of assumes or creates a teleology of a communist political ideology as the dominant political ideology. Rather, I want to really focus on kind of multiple modernities and multiple nationalisms that emerged really in the 1920s and 30s to better situate and understand the rise of different types of political authorities, particularly in the post-colonial state. So the Republic of Vietnam, the 1950s and 60s was very much shaped by its colonial ideologies, for example, and so was the communist authorities in the North. So I'm getting way ahead of myself, so let's get back to kind of the different ways of nationalisms and different ways of understanding, responding, critiquing colonialism during this time. So colonialism, was not a positively well received kind of administrative apparatus. There were many generations and many populations of intellectuals, leaders, teachers, scholars, political activists that were critical and led directly anti-colonial movements. These types of movements can really were sparked since the beginning of French encroachment within the territories in the 1860s, and can be characterized as in three phases. So from the earliest phase as more traditional resistance, where it was very much of a save the king, kind of relying upon the legitimacy of the Vietnamese monarch as a way to garner a anti-colonial nationalist sentiment of resisting of French encroachment. The second period is more of a transitional period of reformism that's characterized very much of these kind of scholars who are trained in one world, which is then like more Confucian traditional classics, and then but also were more in tune also and exposed to other types of modernist movements, either from Japan or China at the time, or even from Western types of ideas and curriculum and even like social scientific principles. And this is more seen as the second phase from 1900 and 1925. The period that I'm going to focus on the most is on the political modernist period from the 20s to the 40s. And this period is really key because it was really very much, as I had mentioned before, in line with the rise of the 20s and 30s of an emergence like of language revolution of people debating what things meant from class meanings to political identities to what it meant to be Vietnamese to what is Vietnamese history, what is Vietnamese language. So this vibrant debate that occurred within the pages of both the vernacular Quốc ngữ press as well as the French language press in Vietnam planted the seeds for many different types of political ideologies and debates, such as nationalism, republicanism, democracy, whether civil liberties, kind of slightly kind of more subtle critiques of the colonial state, and kind of calls for the French colonial government to to follow through with what it claimed to do, which is to bring kind of French civilization and modernity to Vietnam, but in actuality created inequity. And of course, during this period was also the rise of communism. So just very quickly, as I said, the first phase was very much characterized by kind of a monarchy-based support of kind of going and rallying behind the king, the Vietnamese monarch. It was led by imperial bureaucrats, by the Vietnamese bureaucrats to restore the monarch. The second phase, as I said, is very much, you can almost see it as like an intra-Asian modernist phase, very much was inspired by Japan's rise in the 1900s, where Hong Kong was also a hub of Chinese and Vietnamese exiles and political activists. Many of these intellectuals, including Fan Boizhou and Fan Zhijin, traveled to Japan, to China, to France, and were very much exposed to these cosmopolitan ideas and were keen on reforming and revising Confucian learning, were more Western leaning. We're thinking about more reformist approaches to both the colonial administration, but also rethinking what does it mean to be Vietnamese? How do we modernize and strengthen the Vietnamese population? So the transition to a modernist movement was very much, there was a turning point. This turning point emerged in 1925 and 1926, which coalesced in both the trial of Fan Boizhou when he was arrested as this anti-colonial leader, and then when Fan Zhijin also passed away in 1926. Here there were many thousands upon thousands, as you see in this image here, of youth, Vietnamese youth coming to their streets, rallying, being fed up with uh, structural inequality within the French colonial system. Many of these youth intellectuals and students were educated within a French Vietnamese system, so they grew up and came of age in the 20s under French colonial period. They very much kind of organized these different types of political organizations, used different types of print media, radio, photography, drawings to communicate injustice. So you can see in actually even this information here from the 20s to the 30s, the rise of how many newspapers were created as they started to rise, really jumping up to by 1930 from 167 to 267. This period we call, excuse me, a political modernist period, or can also be framed as the modernist nationalist period that were led by many individuals who developed a hybrid political ideology, drawing from nationalism, republicanism, communism, anarchism, all the isms, Leninism, Trotskyism, constitutionalism, reading vastly, widely, reading Bookmu, reading translations, reading both legal and illegal material that were circulated, that were copied. And it's from this period that you have variants from reform and collaboration to outright call for a revolution, overthrow of the anti-colonial state, overthrow of the capitalist system, and the restoration and implementation of the proletariat. There was a very kind of diverse range of different forms of modernist nationalism. These are three figures just to showcase diversity of political thinkers of this time. You have Nguyen Anh Ninh, who was considered a radical, leading ideas of French republicanism as well as anarchism. Wu Guanqiu, who was framed as this collaborationist leader, he actually was considered and he was a political a Vietnamese individual who actually had a seat in the colonial council in Saigon, so was able to essentially play the game and familiarize and succeed in a colonial administrative apparatus. And he was actually able to lead a political party as a Vietnamese individual in the 20s and 30s. And then you have Ho Chi Minh, who was framed and understood as a political ideologist of communism and Stalinism. So from the 20s and 30s, these political organizations, there were many that formed, led by many Vietnamese male youth. They were generally weak because they weren't popular, but they were definitely intellectually rigorous and very experimental. And they failed to overthrow the French during that time. So here's just a range of the different organizations. So I'll point to two just to get a sense of the roots of communism. So by the 20s, 1920, 1926, the Vietnamese Youth League was formed by Ho Chi Minh. And these were proto-party cells that were trained within the Soviet Comintern and the Chinese Communist Party in southern China. By 1927, the VNQDD was also founded and was very much influenced by the Kuomintang nationalists in China. So these early groups looked a lot to China, and they focused on more political and social issues as well as collective. It was more of a collective Leninist organization that was inspired by anti-imperialism and had interconnected members within Tonkin, so the north, and as well as the central. In comparison, Cochin China was not as politically cohesive, but instead was shaped more by anarchism, such as by Widened secret society that was very much focused on radical anti-authoritarianism and was also intersected with many millenarian movements that were motivated within the Mekong Delta, as well as different religious popular sects that emerged during that time. Different religions such as the Gao Dai, the Hua Hao, who believed in different types of utopian ideals, were syncretic and bring together both popular culture, colonial life, and the 1920s and 30s, as well as kind of Western influence. So the Vietnamese Youth League was in October 1930 actually transformed into the Indochinese Communist Party. And what's interesting here was it was formally recognized and founded not in Indochina or Vietnam, but actually in Hong Kong, abroad. So most of the early formations of communism emerged abroad. And Ho Chi Minh was actually exiled and abroad from 30s up until 41. And it's by 1941 that Ho Chi Minh returns to Vietnam and um, shifts more into a broader based Viet Minh that wasn't explicitly communist. So here you have the formation of the Viet Minh. So during World War II, this was really important because the Viet Minh framed themselves not as a communist organization, but as a nationalist organization. And during World War II, a Japanese occupation of Indochina, the Viet Minh led many anti-Japanese and anti-French nationalist movements. By 44, many famines hit North Vietnam, and these famines actually intensified much of kind of the Japanese authorities who requisitioned commodities in Vietnam. So when Japan occupied Indochina and Southeast Asia, they used and forced many of the export production industries towards the Japanese cause. So already um, with basically the forced production and taking of rice, taking of rubber, taking of all the plantation economies and exporting to the war cause, interspersed with famines that were hitting North Vietnam. Many people were dying, starving. And what the Viet Minh did is they would distribute food to people and they would basically attack granaries and rice storage areas and redistribute it to the Vietnamese people, to the poor, starving population, and would provide different types of social assistance and infrastructure. Viet Minh engaged in different types of terrorist, anti-Japanese activities. And actually, during this time, the Viet Minh collaborated with the Office of Strategic Services, a U.S. intelligence agency that was working, of course, against the Japanese. And the Viet Minh and the U.S. Offices of Intelligence actually collaborated together. So this is actually some of the earliest seeds of the relationship between the United States and Vietnam, in this case, of the Viet Minh, who later kind of are the precursors to the Communist Party in North Vietnam. So 1945, the the Viet Minh dissolved and officially became the Workers' Party of Vietnam, and then split up from an Indochina kind of group to a Vietnamese Communist Party, Kampuchea Communist Party, and a Laos People's Party. So I really sped through this super quick just because there's just like so much kind of political elements to discuss. But what I want to take away in the reframing of how we think about the colonial period is also to think about, when did the French regime end? And this is debated a lot just because Vietnam at this point is, pushed into global conflict from World War II. two extensive wars of decolonization. So as I was saying before, Japanese occupation in 1940s, and then by 1945, there was a broad-based August Revolution in Vietnam, and officially Vietnam declared its independence and formed the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So it's very quick here, but Vietnam is then thrown into conflict as post World War II, France attempts to recolonize Vietnam, and this is most famously known as the First Indochina War. So by 1946, the French and the Vietnamese are at war. By 1949, the French give nominal autonomy to the associated states of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. So the associated states here is really what we see as a South Vietnam, or the southern and central region of Vietnam, parts of Hanoi, and then Cambodia and Laos. So this is actually the really confusing part because officially Viet Minh are at war with France as France tries to recolonize. But at the same time, there's also other competing authorities, the Associated States of Vietnam, with its seat in southern Vietnam, as well as in Hanoi. So by 1954, you had the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, overthrowing and ending officially the First Indochina War between the Viet Minh and France. So this was a super fast schematic understanding of a lot of history. What's important here is to think about not just the context of wars, but to understand how it's through these political conflicts and the period of French colonialism that we can understand different turning points in the emergence and history of Vietnamese nationalism. And here I define nationalism very broadly as a form of political identity and political organizing to understand oneself as a unified body, and in this case, it was not always against and explicitly against an imperial force. So concretely, what that looks like is from the 20s and 30s, much of the nationalism discussion was not explicitly about anti-colonialism, anti-French, but was focused on more cohesively defining what is Vietnamese. So a lot of this intersected with modernity projects that were focused on cultural linguistic as well as historical Vietnamese identity. Like what is the Ao Dai? What's the Vietnamese aesthetics? What does Vietnamese language look like? Um, are there certain political ideologies that are more intersected with Vietnamese-ness, Confucianism, nationalism, republicanism, communism? So this is all up to debate. By the 40s, much of the discussion around nationalism was more kind of wrapped within political ideologies of a broad-based nationalism against anti-colonialism. And just for context here, this is like after many decades of oppressive colonial rule, after Vietnam is kind of thrown in World War II and Japanese occupation is starving. Um, many so much of the population is essentially angry and fed up with the inequality of colonialism. And a lot of this nationalist identity was really had its kind of core in the Viet Minh. Then you have other forms of nationalisms that have its roots more within the post-colonial state. So these are what one might see as post-colonial nation building. So here I want to draw attention to the types of nationalisms that had its root not in the north and in Hanoi or with the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh, but more focused on nation building in the Republic of Vietnam. So here you have different types of colonial institutions that turn into post-colonial institutions, and there's a lot of discussion about kind of republicanism, about democracy, about personalism, about different types of visioning about what a modern Vietnamese nation state might look like. And I would characterize a lot of these types of alternative nationalisms having its roots in the associated states that had its roots in 49 up until the 50s, so in the states of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam.